Hello, I'm Joanne. I'm Ed and Lois's oldest child. My family and I are not able to attend this funeral in person because my husband and daughters are teaching in Regina and will likely be exposed to COVID-19. We only want to send our love from our family into Wilkie, not our journeys. Commemorating my father's life is an enormous undertaking because he, in many ways, was larger than life. He was the embodiment of his principles, his faith, his intellect, his personality, and accomplishments. Where do I start? I start with story because Dad was a consummate storyteller. It didn't matter how many times or how many years he told the same story. The story was always fresh because there would be a different emphasis, an additional pause, or a turn of a phrase. He honed those stories over the decades and became a skilled crafter of stories. But Dad, these stories are not going to be wholly your stories, Dad. I would likely get the details mixed up, embellish a few details in my attempt to follow you in your footsteps. So let's start with the first one. Edward Webber was born in Scott and grew up in Revenue near Trapping Lake. His parents were Gwendolyn Webber and Catherine Degenstein, who had immigrated from a village called Mannheim in Russia. Dad's first language was German, as his mother did not speak English for most of her child-rearing years. Dad and his 11 siblings spoke German in the home in honor of their mother. Well, what good did that do for my mother in church? My father commented one day. The Mass was in Latin and the sermon was in English. His sensitivity to her exclusion, however, may have paved the way for his passion for justice for those who are less privileged. What good can come out of revenue? Dad fought the farm kids. He played hooky, stole liquor, and roamed around empty elevators in the middle of the night. He said, "That's why I teach. I know every trick in the book." But teaching aside, one day, after living at least 2 decades in Wilkie, he rummaged in the old Revenue church when it was about to be torn down, in search of music from his childhood. By then, he was a big band saxophone player. He played the trumpet, and Bing Crosby was his music idol. He detested cowboy songs. But he found and dusted off the German music that had been sung by parishioners in Revenue when he was a boy. It was the passion from the Gospel of St. John set to music. He was no innocent choir boy, but he knew he had found gold. He became engrossed in translating the German into English words. He teamed up with Father Lauren, recruited Joe Gillen to play Jesus. He invited members of the other local churches to join in the choir. Easter that year was lifted up into the realm of the heavens. There was no rural church that played cowboy music during the Easter Mass. No, indeed. This was music for God. Dad had his eye on heaven despite his dubious past. I watched my father in his old age pick up things with an uncanny coordination in his fingers and his arms. He moved like an athlete, although he snapped his femur in half last year. When we were all younger, he complained about having to go to university and earn a degree when all he ever wanted to do was to play baseball and hockey. The golf course was his happy place, though. David said that he remembered how Dad, while deep in a conversation with his golfing buddies, would balance the golf ball on the tee and just pop it off into the fairway and onto the green while keeping up the patter. Weekend after weekend, he brought home a trophy, always fulfilling his Sunday obligation ahead of time, even if it meant extra miles on a Saturday night. As the trophies filled up our basement, no one wanted to dust them anymore. They were becoming as commonplace as the grass on the lawn outside. I think that the real trophies were the birdhouses that Dad had built for the purple martins on the golf course. He had this idea that the purple martins would eat the mosquitoes. They never came. But the birdhouses are still there. Dad had a reputation for being a tough schoolmaster. I could hear him roaring down the hallway when I was in class. The teacher would pause. The students in the class would stop chattering to each other, and I held my breath. Time seemed to stand still for all of us when Dad stormed down the hallway, hollering at the top of his lungs. And there were times that he did have twinges of remorse for having reamed out a kid, which was something he did often. It isn't surprising that in a more recent year, when Dad was walking down Main Street and he saw one of his former students and was actually afraid that the student would come for him and enact a revenge strategy, Dad crossed the street to escape the student, hoping that he might avoid an unpleasant encounter. The student crossed the street, called after Dad, caught up with him, and the student praised him, thanking him for his tough approach to teaching. As another former student said, I always hated going to his office when I was in trouble. And yet, when I met him 30 years later, your dad said, I always knew you would be okay. In response to his death, I got emails, letters, and comments from former students that they thought that Dad was one of the finest teachers they ever had. Dad was utterly devoted to his family, although I don't think he liked us much as adults because of our impossible problems. There were mice overrunning Ruth's home. Carol's basement had to be torn out twice because of mold. Dad accompanied David to BC to be interviewed for a teaching position and came home empty-handed, and I moved twice a year for over a decade. But his grandchildren were the apples of his eye. He paid for music lessons. He bought violins and musical instruments. He attended their concerts. He listened to their music and watched their ball and hockey games. Our yearly family feast of German-Russian hobbies always included Uncle Rudy, Dean, and Dana, with whom Dad maintained close ties. Faith. Dad had this thing about staying humble when it came to faith and supernatural things. He wasn't interested in theology or debating doctrine. He was not demonstrative when it came to religious things. In our home, we never had rosary, prayer cards, holy water fountains with Mary statues or crucifixes over every door frame. Well, we did have one, which was decorated with a dried out palm for nearly 10 years. Faith for Dad was about service and being the ordinary, regular kind of guy. But he did have a wicked sense of humor and often issued the dark one-liners under his breath to his buddies in the senior choir. His modesty was overstated while his actions were understated. He became a lay presider, and someone even called him a rent-a-priest. He told many stories about the trip he took to Israel, about the places that they had seen in the Holy Land, but he was very close-mouthed about the impact that the trip had on him. But he told those stories over and over again. And when Dad tells the story often, it's like a blip on the radar that he was trying to fly beneath. But there is one supernatural story that he did tell often, and that was when he asked Mom to become a Catholic so they could get married in the church. And of course, Mom, being a staunch Protestant of orange stock, said no. He told us he prayed the rosary at St. Thomas More College in Saskatoon, hoping for a miracle. Well, he obviously got his miracle. And the only saint that he was ever interested in was St. Anthony. He was out duck hunting one day, took off his glasses so that he could see through his binoculars. After he finished spotting some geese, he put the binoculars down and then couldn't find his glasses. So he prayed and prayed to St. Anthony. And then he gave up and he drove home because it was becoming dark in the twilight. He came back after supper and drove exactly to the spot where he thought he had lost them and stepped out at the side of the gravel road. And when he looked down, there were his glasses right at his feet. That was his second miracle. Nobody really knew what he was thinking about church, God, and prayer, but somehow we caught it. We got the idea that being ordinary people, being of service, doing everyday simple things was really where it was at. He was no prayer muffin, and he didn't want his family to be ones either. He tried so hard to be ordinary, but things slipped out. For example, he was a history buff, and I learned all about the real rebellion and Plato's philosopher king from him. Finally, Dad was a complex person. He was a mass of contradictions. If you had to pick one of the four elements, water, earth, wind, and fire, he was definitely fire. He was fierce in his love for his wife, his family, and his community. His last days on earth were especially difficult, and he fought right to the end. In his final hours, he repeated in a strong, bellowing voice, "This is ridiculous!" He did not go gentle into that good night. With his mother's rosary wrapped around his hand, in his attempt to stay humble, he commanded us to pray the rosary with him. He did not abandon his post, no matter how much he suffered, and he fought right to the end because that was all that he knew to do. Years of dying to oneself, putting up with the blows that life sent him, being stoic and accepting, but not without a real fight. It's best summed up in these words from a favorite poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins. As I read this little snippet, I invite you to think about how complex he was. I want you to hear our father's voice crashing down the hallways at McClay School. He was fire and is now in these incendiary few lines. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is. Then he was what I am, and this joke, poor pock-turd patch, match with immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. Literally, in the next breath, he crooned in the garden at countless funerals is the real cowboy song. That as you step into the garden as an innocent child, now a divine child filled with light and love, we can see from a long ways off that you are an immortal diamond.